All right, today we are jumping into the deep, fascinating world of Muslim philosophy. And let me tell you, this is a tradition that has spent centuries wrestling with the biggest questions you can imagine. Do we really have free will? What does it mean for God to be just? And what's the role of our own minds when we have divine truth right in front of us? Let's get into it. Everything we're going to talk about today really boils down to this one single, powerful question. When you have sacred texts that are the foundation for everything, what do you do with the human mind? Is your job just to listen and accept, or is it to question, to poke, to prod, to really understand? You see, that tension, that's the engine that drove centuries of incredible debate. So, where did all this start? You might be picturing some quiet, dusty library, but nope. It all kicked off in the middle of a booming, rapidly expanding empire that was facing problems no one had ever seen before. Okay, so imagine this. After the Prophet Muhammad's passing, the Muslim community just explodes across the globe. And with that expansion comes all these new challenges, right? New cultures, new political situations, new economic problems, stuff that just wasn't spelled out word for word in the scriptures. They needed a way to figure things out. So to tackle these new issues, early thinkers built this really smart kind of intellectual toolkit. Step one was always go to the primary sources, the Quran and the Hadith. But what if the answer wasn't there? Well, then you move to step two, qiyas, which is basically analogical reasoning. And finally, if an idea gained ijma, or a consensus from the community, it was adopted. This was a great system for law, but some questions went way deeper than just law. And this is it. This is where we get to the absolute heart of the intellectual battle that would define the entire era. This slide just lays out the central battleground perfectly. On one side, you got naql, that's revelation, the divine word. On the other, you got aql, that's reason, the human mind. The huge question that everyone was asking was, are these two in conflict, or are they just two different roads leading to the exact same truth? This tension right here set the stage for everything that followed. So you have this epic tension building. How does it actually manifest? Well, it explodes into these massive debates about some of the most fundamental questions you could possibly ask. Free will versus predestination. This is a big one. And it wasn't just some abstract puzzle for them. No way. This had huge implications for everything, for justice, for morality, for the very nature of God himself. I mean, think about it. If God is all-powerful and knows everything that will ever happen, how can any of us really be free? So, into the ring stepped the Mu'tazila, who you could call Islam's great rationalists. For these thinkers, reason was king, and they were huge champions of free will. Their logic was actually pretty straightforward. For God to be perfectly just, he can't punish you for something you were forced to do. That wouldn't be fair, right? So it follows that humans have to be responsible for our own choices. But then the Ash'aris came along to challenge that idea. They just weren't comfortable with any philosophy that seemed to limit God's absolute power. So they came up with this brilliant middle path. They said, okay, God creates all actions, but humans acquire those actions through their own choice. So God creates the act of walking, but you choose whether you're going to walk to the mosque or away from it. It's that choice, that moment of acquisition, that you're responsible for. It was a really elegant solution. And you've got to love this zinger from Al-Ash'ari himself. A rationalist was arguing that God's attributes, like his knowledge, were basically the same as his essence. And Al-Ash'ari's comeback just cuts right to the point. He's saying, hey, faith is a relationship with a living, divine being, not just some abstract idea. You don't pray to a concept. Now, it's easy to get lost in all these different names, so think of this table as our map of the intellectual landscape. The debates we've been talking about are just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. You had your religio-political schools, like Sunni and Shia, focused on who should lead. Then you had the theological schools, like our friends the Mu'tazila and Ash'ari. And then you had these other groups, the philosophers and the mystics, who are on a completely different journey. So let's talk about those other groups, because beyond the big theological showdowns, there were these two other major streams of thought, and they took a totally different approach to finding truth. First up, you have the philosopha, which literally just means the philosophers. Thinkers like Ibn Rushd, who was so influential he was known in Europe as Averroes, didn't see Greek philosophy as a threat, not at all. They saw Aristotle's logic as a gift from God, a tool to help them better understand revelation. For them, philosophy and revelation were just two different paths leading to the same summit. And then there was another path entirely.
one that wasn't about debating or logic, but about direct, personal experience. This was Sufism, the mystical path within Islam. And the name itself tells you something. It comes from the word suf, or wool, because of the simple, scratchy woolen robes the early mystics wore as a way of saying, I'm not interested in worldly stuff.
Now, what's really fascinating about Sufism is that it wasn't about rejecting the world to find God. The body and soul weren't seen as enemies, they were partners. The physical world wasn't an obstacle, it was part of the spiritual journey. The ultimate goal here wasn't to argue about God in a lecture hall, it was to know God in your heart. Okay, this is so important to get. It's really easy to think of all this as ancient history, something that happened and then ended. But that is not the case. This tradition is alive, and it continued to evolve and respond to the times. I mean, just look at how the conversation shifts over the centuries. You have the big theological fights early on. Then you hit the golden age of the philosophers like Ibn Rushd. Then, a couple centuries later, you get a revolutionary thinker like Ibn Khaldun, who basically invents sociology. And that spirit of inquiry just keeps going right into the modern era with a whole new wave of reformers. And these modern thinkers, guys like Sayyid Ahmed Khan and Sayyid Amir Ali, they were wrestling with brand new challenges: colonialism, modern science, you name it. And what did they argue? They said that the true spirit of Islam is dynamic. It's compatible with progress and reason. They were fighting against this idea of just passively accepting tradition, calling for a return to that intellectual energy that defined the Golden Age. And that really brings us right back to today. Because the conversation that started 1400 years ago, it never stopped. Those same fundamental questions about faith and reason, destiny and free will, justice and the meaning of it all, there still are questions. This incredible tradition isn't a museum piece. It's a living dialogue. And it leaves you wondering, what part are we going to play in it?